Ladies and gentlemen, today we delve into the life of one of the most enigmatic and elusive crime bosses in American history, Vincent the Chin Gigante. A man of contradictions, Gigante was both a feared leader of the Genovese crime family and a master of deception. His story is one of power, manipulation, and an elaborate ruse that baffled law enforcement for decades. Vincent Louis Gigante was born on March 29, 1928, in the heart of New York City's Lower East Side. His parents, Salvatore and Yolanda Gigante, were Italian immigrants who had come to America in search of a better life. Like many Italian-American families in the early 20th century, they settled in Little Italy, a tight-knit community where traditions from the old country remained strong. Growing up in the crowded tenement buildings of Manhattan, young Vincent was one of 5 brothers. His family struggled financially, as his father worked as a watchmaker while his mother, a devout Catholic, did her best to keep the household together. Life in Little Italy was tough, with crime, poverty, and the influence of organized crime shaping the environment around him. The neighborhood was controlled by the Mafia, and young boys often found themselves drawn into that world, either by necessity or admiration for the local gangsters who seemed to wield power and respect. From an early age, Vincent showed a rebellious streak. He was frequently in trouble at school and had little interest in academics. Instead, he gravitated toward the streets, where survival depended on toughness and loyalty. The allure of fast money and the protection that came with mob connections proved irresistible. He became involved in petty crimes as a teenager, working as a street runner and errand boy for local gangsters. Despite his rough upbringing, Gigante's family had aspirations for him beyond the criminal underworld. His mother, in particular, hoped he would take a different path. She was known for her strong religious beliefs and often prayed for her sons to lead honest lives. However, the lure of the Mafia was too strong, especially for someone growing up in the heart of Little Italy, where the presence of mobsters was felt on every corner. While some of his siblings pursued legitimate careers, his brother Louis became a Catholic priest. Vincent was drawn deeper into the criminal underworld. He found a mentor in the powerful mob boss Vito Genovese, who saw potential in the young tough and took him under his wing. By the time he was in his late teens, Vincent Gigante was already deeply embedded in organized crime, setting the stage for a life that would make him one of the most notorious mafia bosses in history. Before Vincent the Chin, Gigante became one of the most feared mafia bosses in American history. He had an entirely different ambition. He wanted to be a professional boxer. In the late 1940s, long before he was known as the boss of the Genovese crime family, Gigante stepped into the ring with dreams of making a name for himself in the world of boxing. Gigante took up boxing as a teenager, training at local gyms in New York City. He was a natural fighter, known for his toughness and resilience in the ring. At 6 feet tall and weighing around 190 pounds, he had the physical build of a formidable boxer. Under the guidance of seasoned trainers, he honed his skills, developing a powerful punch and a strong defensive style. Between 1944 and 1947, Gigante fought as a light heavyweight in at least 25 professional matches. He competed under the nickname The Chin, a name that came from an Americanized version of his mother's affectionate Italian nickname for him, Cincenzo. The nickname would later stick with him throughout his criminal career. During his boxing career, Gigante fought in well-known venues such as Madison Square Garden and other New York arenas, where he faced off against rising stars in the sport. Though he wasn't the most technically skilled fighter, he was known for his endurance and ability to take a hit. His official boxing record was modest, with 21 wins, including 13 by knockout and 4 losses. Despite his efforts, it soon became clear that he wasn't destined for greatness in the boxing world. While training and fighting professionally, Gigante was already involved in street life. The discipline of boxing gave him an edge in the rough streets of Little Italy, where physical toughness was just as valuable as intelligence and connections. Many young Italian Americans at the time saw boxing as a way out of poverty, but for Gigante, it was more of a stepping stone than a long-term career. As he spent more time around gangsters and bookmakers who controlled the boxing scene, he became increasingly entangled in organized crime. He started doing small jobs for the Mafia, running errands and collecting debts for mobsters who controlled illegal gambling rings. Eventually, he realized that the real money and power were not in the ring, but in the underworld. Though he left professional boxing behind in the late 1940s, the skills he learned in the sport, discipline, strategy, and toughness, served him well in his later life as a mob enforcer. His boxing career, while short-lived, helped shape the persona of the man who would later become one of the most cunning and elusive crime bosses in American history. As Vincent Gigante's boxing career faded, his future in organized crime became more certain. While he had dabbled in street-level crimes as a teenager, it was his connection to Vito Genovese that set him on the path to becoming one of the most powerful figures in the Mafia. Genovese, one of the most ambitious and ruthless crime bosses of his time, saw something in the young Gigante: loyalty, physical toughness, and a willingness to follow orders without question. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Gigante became a trusted enforcer for Genovese. At the time, Genovese was working to expand his influence within the Mafia and was engaged in a power struggle against rival bosses. He needed men who were not only physically strong but also completely loyal, men who wouldn't hesitate to use violence when necessary. Gigante fit the profile perfectly. Under Genovese's guidance, Gigante quickly rose through the ranks. His early assignments included collecting debts, intimidating rivals, and carrying out violent enforcement actions. He earned a reputation as someone who was reliable and unflinchingly brutal when required. Unlike some gangsters who sought attention and enjoyed the glamorous lifestyle of the Mafia, Gigante was more reserved and disciplined. He understood that power in the underworld was not just about violence but also about patience, secrecy, and strategic thinking, all lessons he absorbed from his mentor. One of the most defining moments in Gigante's early criminal career came in 1957 when Genovese ordered him to carry out an assassination attempt on Frank Costello, a powerful mob boss who had previously led the Luciano crime family, which would later become the Genovese crime family. At the time, Genovese was determined to take full control of the organization, and eliminating Costello was a necessary step in his plan. On the night of May 2nd, 1957, Gigante waited outside Costello's apartment building on Central Park West in Manhattan. When Costello entered the lobby, Gigante approached him and fired a single shot. However, whether due to nerves, poor aim, or a last-second movement by Costello, the bullet only grazed his head. Costello fell to the ground but survived. Instead of seeking revenge, Costello took the hint and stepped away from power, allowing Genovese to become the undisputed boss. This failed assassination attempt was a major event in Mafia history, and although it was not entirely successful, it proved Gigante's loyalty and solidified his status within the organization. He was arrested for the shooting but managed to avoid serious consequences when Costello refused to identify him as the gunman, demonstrating the Mafia's strict code of silence, or omerta. After this, Gigante's influence within the Genovese family grew. He was rewarded for his loyalty and became an increasingly trusted lieutenant. Over the next few decades, he learned how to navigate the world of organized crime from Genovese, adopting his mentor's methods of operating in secrecy and avoiding law enforcement attention. While other mob bosses sought media attention or indulged in extravagant lifestyles, Genovese taught Gigante that true power came from staying in the shadows. This mentorship shaped Gigante into the mob boss he would later become, calculating, paranoid, and willing to do whatever it took to maintain control. By the time Genovese died in 1969, Gigante was well on his way to becoming one of the most powerful and elusive Mafia leaders in American history. One of the most pivotal moments in Vincent the Chin, Gigante's early criminal career came in 1957 when he was tasked with carrying out an assassination attempt on Frank Costello, a legendary mob boss who had once ruled over what would later be called the Genovese crime family. This event not only solidified Gigante's reputation within the Mafia but also played a crucial role in reshaping the power structure of organized crime in New York. At the time, the Mafia was going through a period of intense internal conflict. Vito Genovese, Gigante's mentor, had been seeking to take complete control of the powerful crime family that had originally been led by Lucky Luciano and later by Costello. Although Costello had largely stepped away from day-to-day operations, he still held considerable influence. Genovese saw him as an obstacle and decided that eliminating him was the only way to secure full control of the organization. Vincent Gigante, still a relatively young and rising figure in the Mafia, was given the crucial assignment. It was a high-stakes job. Taking out a powerful, well-connected figure like Costello was not an easy task. But Gigante had already earned a reputation as a loyal and ruthless enforcer, and Genovese trusted him to get the job done. On the evening of May 2nd, 1957, Gigante waited outside Costello's luxurious apartment building at 115 Central Park West in Manhattan. It was a bold and dangerous mission, as Costello was always cautious and usually had security around him. However, on this particular night, Costello was alone when he arrived at the building. As he stepped into the lobby, Gigante emerged from the shadows, raised his .38 caliber revolver, and fired a single shot at Costello's head. The bullet grazed Costello's skull, leaving a deep wound, but miraculously, he survived. Instead of collapsing, he stumbled forward, clutching his bleeding head, and managed to make it to safety. Gigante, realizing that he had failed to finish the job, quickly fled the scene. In the days that followed, law enforcement launched an investigation into the attempted murder. Costello, despite being injured, adhered to the Mafia's strict code of omerta. He refused to cooperate with the police. When asked who had shot him, he famously replied, "I didn't see a thing." This act of silence not only saved Gigante from immediate legal consequences, but also demonstrated the deep-rooted loyalty and secrecy within the Mafia. Even though the assassination attempt had failed, it still accomplished its intended purpose. Costello, realizing that his life was in danger and that Genovese was determined to take over, decided to step down from his leadership position rather than retaliate. He quietly withdrew from the Mafia's power structure, effectively handing control of the crime family to Genovese. For Gigante, the botched hit became both a badge of honor and a symbol of his unwavering loyalty to Genovese. Despite failing to kill Costello, he was not punished for his mistake. Instead, his standing within the organization grew, and he continued to climb the ranks, gaining more influence and responsibility within the Genovese crime family. However, law enforcement did not forget about the incident. Gigante was eventually arrested and charged with attempted murder. But thanks to the lack of witnesses and Costello's refusal to testify, he was acquitted in 1958, once again slipping through the cracks of the legal system. This would not be the last time that Gigante managed to outmaneuver the authorities, a skill that would define his career in organized crime for decades to come. By the time the 1980s arrived, Vincent the Chin, Gigante had risen to the pinnacle of organized crime, becoming the boss of the Genovese crime family, the most powerful and secretive of New York's 5 families. His ascent was not immediate, but was the result of decades of loyalty, strategic maneuvering, and a deep understanding of how the Mafia operated. Unlike some mobsters who sought power aggressively and openly, Gigante played a long game, carefully positioning himself as a leader who valued secrecy and control above all else. After the failed assassination attempt on Frank Costello in 1957, Gigante continued to rise within the Mafia ranks. His mentor, Vito Genovese, took control of the crime family, but his reign was short-lived. In 1959, Genovese was convicted on drug trafficking charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison, leaving a leadership vacuum within the organization. Although Genovese continued to exert influence from behind bars, the day-to-day operations of the family fell into the hands of a ruling panel of trusted capos, including Gigante. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Gigante solidified his position as a major player within the family. He oversaw criminal enterprises such as illegal gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and extortion, ensuring that money continued to flow into the family's coffers. Unlike other mobsters who sought attention or indulged in flashy lifestyles, Gigante operated from the shadows, keeping a low profile and reinforcing the Genovese family's reputation as the most disciplined and secretive of the 5 families. During this period, Gigante was also known for his intense paranoia. He avoided using telephones, rarely spoke directly to lower-ranking members, and often relied on hand signals and intermediaries to communicate orders. This cautious approach made it difficult for law enforcement to gather evidence against him, as he left little to no direct proof of his involvement in criminal activities. His methods were in stark contrast to other mob bosses, such as John Gotti of the Gambino family, who openly flaunted their wealth and power. Gigante's true rise to power began in the late 1970s when Philip Benny Squint Lombardo, who had been acting as the family's boss, decided to step aside. Lombardo, recognizing Gigante's intelligence and leadership skills, handpicked him as his successor. However, Gigante did not immediately assume the official title of boss. Instead, he continued the tradition of using a front boss, a figurehead who would take the heat from law enforcement while the real power remained hidden. Anthony Fat Tony Salerno was placed in this role, allowing Gigante to operate behind the scenes. For years, the FBI and law enforcement agencies mistakenly believed that Salerno was the actual leader of the Genovese family. This deception worked perfectly, as it kept Gigante out of the spotlight and protected him from direct prosecution. Meanwhile, he continued to expand the family's influence, ensuring that the Genovese organization remained the most powerful and financially successful of the New York Mafia families. It wasn't until the mid-1980s that law enforcement began to suspect that Gigante was the true boss. In 1986, Salerno was convicted in the famous Mafia Commission trial, which targeted the leaders of New York's 5 families. However, by then, it was becoming increasingly clear that Salerno had been a puppet and that the real power had always rested with Gigante. With Salerno out of the picture, Gigante fully stepped into his role as the undisputed boss of the Genovese crime family. His leadership style was different from that of other bosses. He ran the family with an iron grip but maintained an air of invisibility. His ability to control his men, maintain discipline, and keep law enforcement at bay made him one of the most effective and long-lasting mafia bosses of the 20th century. By the late 1980s, Gigante had complete control over a vast criminal empire that stretched across New York and beyond. He had successfully outmaneuvered both rival mobsters and law enforcement, proving himself to be a master strategist. However, with increased federal investigations and the rise of government informants, the noose around him was slowly beginning to tighten. One of the most remarkable and bizarre aspects of Vincent, the Chin, Gigante's life, was his elaborate scheme to feign mental illness for decades, a tactic that earned him the nickname the Odd Father. Unlike many other mob bosses who relied on bribery, intimidation, or legal maneuvering to evade law enforcement, Gigante took an entirely different approach. He convinced the world that he was insane. This deception allowed him to run the powerful Genovese crime family from the shadows while avoiding prosecution for years. Gigante's act began in the 1960s, long before he officially became the boss of the Genovese family. As federal authorities began increasing their efforts to take down organized crime, mobsters were finding it harder to escape conviction. Gigante, realizing that law enforcement would eventually come for him, devised a strategy that was both unconventional and highly effective. He would act as though he was mentally unfit to stand trial. He began displaying strange behavior in public, often wandering the streets of Greenwich Village in New York wearing nothing but a bathrobe and slippers. He would mutter incoherently to himself, appearing disoriented and lost. Witnesses reported seeing him urinate in the streets, talk to lampposts, and seemingly lose all sense of reality. At times, he would appear to be completely incapacitated, unable to recognize even his closest associates. Gigante's family and legal team reinforced the illusion. Over the years, his lawyers repeatedly submitted medical reports claiming that he suffered from schizophrenia, dementia, and other mental disorders. He was examined by multiple psychiatrists who, based on his erratic behavior and the testimony of his relatives, diagnosed him as mentally unfit to stand trial. His mother and siblings supported his claims, with his brother Louis Gigante, a well-respected Catholic priest, vouching for his supposed mental illness. This ruse worked for decades. Whenever law enforcement tried to charge him, his lawyers successfully argued that he was too mentally unstable to be held accountable for any crimes. In the 1970s, 1980s, and even into the 1990s, prosecutors struggled to bring him to justice because every time they attempted to take him to court, his defense team presented compelling medical evidence that he was unfit to stand trial. Despite his supposed insanity, Gigante was still running one of the most powerful crime families in America. He carefully managed the Genovese family's operations from behind the scenes, using intermediaries to relay his orders. He never spoke directly on the phone, never wrote anything down, and only communicated through trusted associates. His paranoia about surveillance was legendary. He believed that law enforcement was always watching, and he made sure never to discuss business openly. Even his closest associates played along with the act, knowing that it was a brilliant way to shield him from prosecution. In reality, Gigante was a calculating and highly intelligent leader who ruled the Genovese crime family with an iron grip. Anyone who defied him faced severe consequences, including beatings or even death. For years, law enforcement officials knew that Gigante's insanity was an act, but proving it in court was nearly impossible. FBI agents and prosecutors followed him for decades, watching as he seamlessly switched between his insane public persona and his true self when conducting mafia business. However, without concrete evidence, they could do little to dismantle his carefully constructed illusion. His deception became legendary, making him one of the most elusive and mysterious figures in mafia history. While other bosses were being arrested, convicted, and sent to prison, Gigante continued to evade justice by playing the role of a mentally ill old man who had no idea what was happening around him. His strategy frustrated law enforcement and cemented his reputation as one of the most cunning and unorthodox leaders the Mafia had ever seen. Vincent the Chin, Gigante was unlike many other Mafia bosses of his time. While others, like John Gotti of the Gambino family, basked in the spotlight and embraced a flashy lifestyle, Gigante took a completely different approach. He believed that secrecy and discipline were the keys to maintaining power and keeping law enforcement at bay. Under his leadership, the Genovese crime family became the most secretive, structured, and effective of New York's 5 families. Gigante ruled with an iron grip, demanding absolute loyalty and discretion from his subordinates. Unlike other crime families, where bosses were frequently exposed due to informants or careless conversations, Gigante ensured that the Genovese family operated like a well-oiled machine. He instilled a strict code of silence, reinforcing the Mafia's tradition of omerta, the vow of secrecy that forbade members from cooperating with authorities. Anyone who violated this code faced severe consequences, often in the form of violent retribution. One of the defining aspects of Gigante's leadership was his use of buffers, intermediaries who relayed his orders to lower-ranking members. He almost never communicated directly with anyone outside his inner circle. Instead of holding traditional sit-down meetings with captains and soldiers, he relied on trusted lieutenants to carry out his instructions. This system made it incredibly difficult for law enforcement to gather direct evidence against him because he left no paper trail, made no phone calls, and rarely spoke openly about criminal activities. His paranoia about law enforcement was legendary. He was convinced that the FBI had him under constant surveillance, and he took extreme precautions to avoid detection. He refused to discuss mafia business in public places, never wrote anything down, and insisted that his men speak in coded language. He even ordered mobsters to avoid mentioning his name altogether. When discussing him, they were instructed to either nod or point to their chins, reinforcing his nickname, the Chin. Gigante also maintained discipline within the family by ruthlessly eliminating threats. If he suspected someone of being an informant, he did not hesitate to have them killed. He was particularly harsh on those who failed to follow his rules. He viewed disobedience as a direct challenge to his authority, and those who crossed him often disappeared. This approach ensured that the Genovese family remained one of the most tightly controlled and stable organizations in the Mafia. Another key aspect of his leadership was his ability to adapt. Unlike other bosses who were rigid in their ways, Gigante understood that survival in the Mafia required evolving tactics. He continued to expand the family's operations, controlling lucrative rackets such as extortion, labor union corruption, loan sharking, and illegal gambling. He also developed strong ties with corrupt politicians, businessmen, and labor union officials, allowing the Genovese family to extend its influence far beyond traditional street-level crimes. Under Gigante's command, the Genovese crime family avoided the mistakes that led to the downfall of other mafia organizations. While the Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families were plagued by informants, high-profile arrests, and internal power struggles, the Genovese family remained remarkably stable. Gigante's leadership ensured that they continued to thrive even as law enforcement intensified its efforts to dismantle the mafia. Despite his bizarre public persona, Gigante was one of the most intelligent and methodical crime bosses of his time. He understood that power in the mafia was not about making headlines. It was about control, discipline, and secrecy. By enforcing these principles, he kept the Genovese family strong and ensured that they remained the most formidable crime syndicate in the United States. For decades, law enforcement agencies, particularly the FBI, were determined to bring down Vincent the Chin Gigante. He was widely recognized as the true power behind the Genovese crime family, yet prosecutors struggled to build a case against him. His ability to evade justice was not just due to the mafia's traditional code of secrecy. It was a direct result of his own meticulous, paranoid, and strategic approach to leadership. From the 1960s onward, the FBI knew that Gigante was deeply involved in organized crime. He had already made headlines with his 1957 assassination attempt on Frank Costello, and as he climbed the ranks of the Genovese family, his influence became undeniable. However, despite their best efforts, law enforcement found it nearly impossible to gather solid evidence that directly tied him to criminal activities. One of the biggest obstacles in convicting Gigante was the way he structured the Genovese crime family. Unlike other bosses, he refused to meet directly with lower-ranking members or discuss business in public. Instead, he used a system of intermediaries, also known as buffers, to relay his orders. This meant that even if a mobster was caught committing a crime, they could never directly implicate Gigante because they had never personally spoken to him about it. Additionally, Gigante took extreme measures to avoid being recorded by authorities. While other mobsters were caught on FBI wiretaps discussing crimes in explicit detail, Gigante rarely, if ever, spoke openly about illegal activities. He also insisted that his men never use his name. If they needed to refer to him, they would either nod or point to their chins. This simple yet effective strategy ensured that even if law enforcement intercepted their conversations, they could never definitively prove who was being discussed. The FBI's frustration grew throughout the 1970s and 1980s as they watched Gigante solidify his power while avoiding any real consequences. Wiretaps, surveillance, and informants all pointed to his control over the Genovese crime family, but prosecutors struggled to build a case that would hold up in court. Every time they attempted to bring charges against him, he managed to slip away, either through lack of evidence or through his infamous insanity defense. By the mid-1980s, law enforcement intensified its efforts to take him down. The FBI launched a series of high-profile mafia cases, including the famous Mafia Commission trial of 1986, which successfully convicted key leaders of the five families. However, Gigante was not among those convicted. His strategy of staying in the shadows had once again protected him. Despite this, the FBI refused to give up. They increased surveillance, flipped informants, and gathered more intelligence on the Genovese family's activities. However, even as other bosses like John Gotti were caught on tape bragging about murders and illegal dealings, Gigante continued to evade their grasp. One of the biggest turning points in law enforcement's pursuit of Gigante came in the early 1990s, when several high-ranking members of the Genovese family began cooperating with authorities. These informants provided crucial details about the family's operations, including testimony that confirmed Gigante's role as the true boss. However, even with this information, prosecutors still had to overcome the decades-long facade of his mental illness, which had convinced multiple doctors, lawyers, and even judges that he was unfit for trial. As law enforcement pressure mounted, Gigante's once impenetrable defenses began to crack. The FBI and federal prosecutors were determined to prove that his mental illness was an act and that he was, in fact, running a vast criminal empire. They needed undeniable proof that he was fully competent and actively involved in the Mafia's illegal operations. This set the stage for a legal battle that would ultimately test whether the mastermind behind the Genovese family could continue to outsmart the LAW. By the 1990s, Vincent the Chin, Gigante's decades-long run as an untouchable mafia boss, was beginning to unravel. For years, law enforcement had struggled to convict him, hindered by his elaborate charade of mental illness and the extreme secrecy with which he operated the Genovese crime family. However, as the FBI refined its strategies and key mafia insiders began cooperating, the walls started closing in on the elusive and enigmatic boss. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, the FBI made significant strides in dismantling New York's five families. The famous Mafia Commission trial of 1986 had already led to the conviction of several top bosses, and subsequent trials further weakened the Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families. However, the Genovese crime family, under Gigante's leadership, remained the most insulated and disciplined, making it far more difficult to penetrate. Federal prosecutors knew that if they wanted to take down Gigante, they needed solid evidence. Testimonies from insiders who had first-hand knowledge of his crimes. This proved challenging, as the Genovese family had a reputation for being the most tight-lipped of the mafia organizations. Unlike the other families, which had seen numerous members flip and testify in court, the Genovese family had far fewer informants. This was largely due to Gigante's strict enforcement of secrecy and the brutal punishments he ordered for suspected traitors. However, by the early 1990s, things began to change. Law enforcement had intensified its pressure on the mafia, using new investigative techniques such as advanced wiretapping, financial tracking, and RICO, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, indictments, which allowed prosecutors to target entire criminal organizations rather than just individuals. These legal tools had already been successfully used against other mobsters, and now they were being aimed directly at Gigante. The biggest breakthrough came when several high-ranking members of the Genovese family decided to turn against him. Facing long prison sentences, some of Gigante's closest associates began cooperating with federal authorities, providing key details about his involvement in murder conspiracies, extortion, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. Their testimonies painted a clear picture of Gigante as the true boss of the Genovese family, shattering the long-standing illusion that he was merely a mentally ill old man with no connection to organized crime. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence came from Peter Savino, a mafia associate who had worked closely with the Genovese family. Savino turned informant and provided crucial details about Gigante's control over various illegal operations. His testimony, combined with that of other informants, helped law enforcement build a strong case linking Gigante to multiple crimes, including murder conspiracies. By 1997, prosecutors had gathered enough evidence to formally indict Gigante on charges of racketeering, murder conspiracies, and other crimes. The indictment accused him of orchestrating numerous criminal activities over several decades, including ordering hits on suspected informants and rivals. The government's case was bolstered by years of FBI surveillance, wiretaps, and financial records that traced money flowing directly from the Genovese family's illicit enterprises back to Gigante. For the first time in his long criminal career, Gigante faced a legal battle he could not easily escape. His carefully constructed insanity defense, which had shielded him for decades, was now being challenged by overwhelming evidence. Prosecutors were determined to prove that his mental illness was a ruse, and they had a growing list of witnesses ready to testify against him. As Gigante's legal troubles mounted, the pressure on him and his organization intensified. The once untouchable boss, who had ruled the underworld with secrecy and discipline, now faced the very real possibility of conviction. His fate would soon be decided in a courtroom, where prosecutors aimed to dismantle the final layers of his deception and hold him accountable for a lifetime of crime. By the late 1990s, Vincent the Chin, Gigante's carefully maintained empire of secrecy and deception, was finally beginning to crumble. After decades of eluding law enforcement through his bizarre public behavior and tight control over the Genovese crime family, he found himself at the center of a federal trial that would determine his fate. The FBI, armed with years of surveillance, wiretaps, and testimony from former associates, had built a strong case against him. The prosecution was determined to expose the man behind the bathrobe, the ruthless and calculating crime boss who had ruled the underworld for decades. The trial against Gigante was one of the most anticipated mafia cases of the decade. Prosecutors charged him with multiple counts of racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. They alleged that he had ordered numerous hits on both rival gangsters and members of his own organization who were suspected of being informants. The government argued that despite his well-publicized mental health issues, Gigante had been fully in control of the Genovese crime family and had successfully manipulated the justice system for years. One of the key challenges for prosecutors was proving that Gigante's mental illness was an act. For decades, his legal team had successfully convinced judges that he was unfit to stand trial due to schizophrenia, dementia, and other cognitive disorders. His attorneys once again argued that he was incapable of understanding the charges against him, pointing to years of medical records and psychiatric evaluations that described him as delusional and mentally incapacitated. They presented doctors who testified that Gigante suffered from significant mental impairments and was unable to participate in his own defense. However, the prosecution was ready. They countered Gigante's insanity defense with powerful evidence, including testimony from Mafia informants who had seen him conducting business, as usual, behind closed doors. Several high-ranking members of the Genovese family turned against him, including Peter Savino and others who had been directly involved in carrying out his orders. These witnesses described Gigante as a highly intelligent and ruthless leader who had maintained tight control over the family's operations while carefully orchestrating his fake insanity act. The FBI also presented surveillance footage of Gigante acting normally in private moments, directly contradicting his public persona as a confused and mentally unstable man. Investigators had spent years following him, watching as he seamlessly transitioned from his disoriented street performances to giving precise orders to his subordinates. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from recorded conversations where Gigante's own associates admitted that his insanity act was a long-running scheme to keep him out of prison. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the government's case against Gigante was stronger than any he had faced before. Unlike previous attempts to prosecute him, this case had multiple witnesses, financial records, and surveillance evidence tying him directly to organized crime. The court was no longer willing to accept his insanity claims at face value, and his longtime strategy of deception was unraveling before him. In 1997, after a lengthy trial, Vincent Gigante was finally convicted on federal racketeering charges. The jury found him guilty of running a vast criminal enterprise that engaged in extortion, loan sharking, labor union corruption, and murder conspiracies. His conviction marked the end of an era. After years of avoiding prosecution, the once untouchable mafia boss was now facing the full weight of the law. When sentencing arrived, the judge took into account the decades of criminal activity Gigante had orchestrated, as well as the elaborate lengths he had gone to in order to avoid justice. In a decisive ruling, he was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Despite his legal team's continued efforts to argue for leniency based on his supposed mental condition, the judge and prosecutors dismissed his insanity claims, stating that he had been competent enough to run a powerful criminal organization for decades. Gigante's conviction was a major victory for law enforcement. The Genovese crime family, once the most impenetrable of New York's mafia organizations, had finally been dealt a serious blow. His sentencing sent a message to the remaining leaders of organized crime. Even the most careful and strategic bosses could not evade justice forever. However, even from behind bars, Gigante remained a figure of influence within the underworld, and his story was far from over. By the early 2000s, Vincent the Chin, Gigante was no longer the invincible crime boss who had outmaneuvered law enforcement for decades. He was now an aging prisoner, serving time for racketeering and murder conspiracies, and his health was beginning to deteriorate. However, despite his conviction, he still clung to the one strategy that had protected him for so long, his claim of mental illness. For years, even from behind bars, Gigante continued to insist that he was severely mentally impaired, hoping that this long-established defense might one day earn him an early release or a transfer to a medical facility instead of a high-security prison. But federal prosecutors were not done with him yet. Even after his 1997 conviction, law enforcement remained determined to dismantle what was left of the Genovese crime family. In 2002, Gigante was indicted again, this time on charges of obstruction of justice. Prosecutors argued that his decades-long insanity act had been nothing more than an elaborate deception designed to obstruct federal investigations and avoid prosecution. They alleged that he had used doctors, family members, and lawyers to help maintain the illusion that he was mentally incompetent, all while secretly running one of the most powerful criminal enterprises in America. Facing new charges, Gigante found himself in a situation unlike any he had encountered before. This time, the evidence was overwhelming, and his legal team knew that the insanity defense would no longer hold up. Multiple witnesses, including former Genovese family members who had turned informant, had testified that his mental illness had been an act. The government had also gathered years of surveillance footage showing him switching between his insane public persona and his clear, calculating leadership behind closed doors. Under mounting legal pressure and with no realistic way to fight the charges, Gigante did something he had never done before. He admitted the truth. In 2003, at the age of 75, he finally confessed in federal court that his mental illness had been a decades-long ruse. It was a stunning admission from a man who had built his entire criminal legacy on deception and secrecy. His confession was part of a plea deal in which he admitted to obstructing justice by faking insanity to evade prosecution. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to recommend a reduced sentence for the new charges. However, the damage to his reputation as a master manipulator was done. For years, law enforcement had known the truth, but having Gigante himself acknowledge it in open court was a moment of vindication for the FBI and prosecutors who had spent decades trying to convict him. Gigante's admission also had ripple effects throughout the Mafia world. It was a rare and humiliating moment for a high-ranking mob boss to publicly acknowledge a long-running deception. His decades of carefully cultivated secrecy and discipline had ultimately collapsed under the weight of legal pressure. For younger mobsters who had once viewed him as an untouchable legend, his confession served as a stark reminder that even the most powerful mafia figures could be brought down. After his confession, Gigante remained in prison, his health declining as he aged behind bars. His influence within the Genovese crime family had significantly diminished, and the organization was forced to adapt to a new era where law enforcement had become more aggressive in its pursuit of organized crime. Though the Genovese family remained powerful, the days of Gigante's iron-fisted rule were over. Even in his final years, Gigante's life remained a subject of fascination. How had he managed to keep up the act for so long? How many people, doctors, lawyers, even members of his own family, had knowingly or unknowingly helped him maintain the illusion? His confession confirmed what many had long suspected, but it also left lingering questions about the extent of his deception and how deeply it had shaped the modern mafia. Vincent the Chin, Gigante spent the final years of his life in federal prison, a stark contrast to the decades he had spent as one of the most elusive and powerful mafia bosses in American history. His health had been in steady decline ever since his conviction, and after his 2003 confession that his long-standing insanity act had been a ruse, he had little left to fight for. The man who had once ruled the Genovese crime family with an iron grip, demanding secrecy, enforcing discipline, and outwitting law enforcement, was now just another aging prisoner serving out the last days of his life. On December 19, 2005, Gigante passed away at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He was 77 years old. The official cause of death was heart disease, though he had suffered from various health problems in his later years, including strokes and other cardiovascular issues. Unlike some of his fellow mafia bosses who met violent ends, either through assassination or betrayal, Gigante died quietly in a prison hospital, far from the power and influence he had once wielded. Despite his death, Gigante's impact on the mafia and law enforcement remained profound. His leadership style had set him apart from other crime bosses. While figures like John Gotti reveled in public attention, wearing flashy suits and making headlines, Gigante believed in the power of secrecy. His strategy of avoiding the limelight helped the Genovese family remain the most stable and enduring of New York's 5 families, even as others suffered from high-profile arrests and internal betrayals. One of Gigante's most lasting legacies was his elaborate deception, the decades-long act in which he convinced the world that he was mentally unfit to stand trial. No other mob boss in history had gone to such extreme lengths to evade justice. For years, he roamed the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe and slippers, muttering to himself, while in reality, he was orchestrating one of the most powerful criminal empires in the country. His ability to manipulate the legal system frustrated law enforcement for decades, and his tactics became legendary in Mafia history. His death also marked the end of an era for the Genovese crime family. Under his leadership, the organization had thrived by maintaining its core principles: secrecy, discipline, and strategic decision-making. Even after his imprisonment, the Genovese family continued to be one of the most powerful crime syndicates in America, largely because of the structure Gigante had built. Unlike other families that had been weakened by high-profile informants and internal power struggles, the Genovese family remained relatively intact. Law enforcement officials viewed Gigante's story as both a victory and a cautionary tale. On one hand, they had ultimately succeeded in convicting him, proving that even the most careful and elusive crime boss could not escape justice forever. On the other hand, his ability to evade prosecution for so long highlighted the challenges of taking down organized crime figures who operated with discipline and cunning. His legacy extended beyond the mafia and law enforcement. His story became the subject of books, documentaries, and endless discussions about how one man had managed to deceive both the criminal underworld and the justice system for so long. He became a symbol of both the power and the eventual downfall of the American Mafia, a man who had outlasted many of his contemporaries but had ultimately met the same fate as all those who sought to defy the law. Even today, Vincent Gigante's name is synonymous with secrecy, deception, and the old-school mafia code. His tactics continue to be studied by law enforcement agencies, and his unique approach to organized crime remains a fascinating chapter in the history of the American underworld. Though he is gone, his influence lingers in the world he helped shape, leaving behind a legacy that will not soon be forgotten.